Hello and happy carnival to everybody. This is BIOL3465, Tropical Forest Ecology and Use, our lecture on biotic interactions in tropical rainforests. So we're moving from biotic characteristics into looking at how the different components, biotic components of the tropical rainforests interact. And our first interaction is competition between plants. We are going to be looking at how plants strategize their lives, their life history strategy, in response to the particular biotic and abiotic conditions which exist in a tropical rainforest. As always, this is pitched in the frame of management of tropical rainforests. Biotic interactions are very prevalent in tropical rainforests, and therefore they have a big influence on tropical rainforests and how tropical rainforests can be managed. I make a pledge to try and not say okay in this lecture for the whole lecture. Let's see if that works. Oops, I just said it. In this lecture we're going to take a look at life histories of plants. We're going to step back from tropical rainforests and just look at all the plants in the world and get you centered on how those plants what strategies those plants use to survive in the different ecosystems around the world, and then we'll take that back to tropical rainforests. We'll take a look at the growth forms of these different plants, which fit in with their different life history strategies. We'll take a look at some of the trade-offs which inevitably result from these different growth forms, which are in response to the different life history strategies, and finally we'll take a look at some of the resources for which plants compete, and in particular what plants compete for in a tropical rainforest. So first of all, let's look at the life histories of plants. The main goal of a plant species is to persist and increase in an ecosystem. So if you have a plant species, if every plant species, their main goal is to try and pass their genes on to the next generation, and to allow the next generation or members of the same species to persist in that ecosystem into the future. So plants, like all living things, want to try and propagate the species, make the species last, allow the species to continue in the ecosystem. And there are two main ways or two main strategies into which plants can direct their resources: reproduction and survival. So plants can strategize, can take two main areas of strategy. They can either take the reproduction route or they can take the survival route. And it's different combinations of these strategies which make up a plant species' life history. Okay. Oh, shut up. Alright, life histories of plants. If competition, the life histories of plants in an ecosystem may be successful in different ways. So if the environment is has a particular condition, then one particular life history is probably going to be more successful. If the environment, however, is a different way, then the next life history strategy may be more important. Generally, if competition is great, in other words, if resources are scarce and what resources there are available are being competed for very keenly, then plants need to have the adaptations, they need to have the strategies to be able to compete fiercely for those resources and get the resources. So if competition is great, then it is better to invest more in the adaptations which are needed to get those resources. Getting those resources means survival for that species in that ecosystem. So if competition is great, then plants must by force spend more of their resources on survival, on the adaptations which allow them to compete efficiently for those limited resources for which the competition is so great. These plants are also known as K-selected plants. They invest a lot in adaptations for good competition, so they are specialists in their ecosystem. Trees generally are a good example of K-selected plants, but within the trees there will be K-selected and R-selected plants. Trees in an undisturbed rainforest and in a rainforest in general are the most obvious example of these K-selected plants which invest in survival before they invest anything in reproduction. And that brings us on to the next life history strategy, which is successful if competition is not very high in the ecosystem. So if the ecosystem has abundant resources available, but there isn't many plants, or there isn't enough biomass in the plants to compete for those resources, so there's a lot of resources available, then it is better for the plant to invest in reproduction as quickly as possible. These are the plants which have a short lifespan, which are able to go through their entire life cycle from seed, germination, growth, reproduction, seed dispersal and death within a very short time span. One of the main types of these sorts of species are the annual plants. Now, annual plants are plants which are able to complete their life cycle in 1 year, and they're quite common in the temperate regions where plants will try and get annual plants will try and get their life cycle completed during the summer months. Now, that only works if there are enough resources to allow the plants to grow and reproduce in a relatively quick period of time. That means there must be abundant resources around. Now, another way that you can take a look at these different life history strategies, in other words, the one for survival and the one for reproduction, is to propose that within an ecosystem there is a certain amount of resources, and a certain amount of those, a certain level of resources are needed before a plant can indulge in reproduction. In an ecosystem where resources are very limited, then there simply isn't enough resources around in the ecosystem for reproduction to take place, at least initially. On the other hand, in an ecosystem where there is enough resources immediately, then reproduction can take place very quickly, and the plants don't have to wait as long. In the case of a tropical rainforest, resources on the forest floor, and in particular light, but also nutrients and water, are in short supply because they're well competed for by all the other trees and all the other plants. The most obvious resource which is competed for is light, and we'll see more of that at the end. And a plant cannot reproduce until it gets enough light in a tropical rainforest. And this is not always the case, but it's a generalization. Right, so we have our two main strategies of survival, trying to build a body which is very competitive and able to access enough resources through that competition to be able to reproduce, which can take a lot of time and build some very large and spectacular bodies like trees in a tropical rainforest. And the other strategy which works when there is a lot of resources around, there's a lot of light around, a lot of nutrients around, and this would be the species which can utilize that vast amount of resources and reproduce very quickly. Now, why would you have an ecosystem which has large amounts of resources? Well, usually those are the types of ecosystems which are periodically disturbed. Now, the disturbance which releases those resources to the plants may be a regular yearly event, like winter in the temperate regions, or the event may be something like a regular fire event. In both cases, there are periods which occur at regular intervals, in some cases yearly, and in some cases more irregularly. And when those resources are available, there's large amounts of them. So it's in the best interests of the species then to be able to take advantage of those resources. Okay? In a tropical rainforest, I said okay, oh damn it. In a tropical rainforest, there is no disturbance. Everything is pretty much the same. So the resources aren't released by the plants. They don't die back during the winter. They're not burnt by a fire. And instead the resources, the nutrients, are all locked up within the body. So they become depleted and become in shorter and shorter supply. So therefore the plants must need to join that competition rat race to be able to survive and to finally get enough resources together, if they can sequester resources, for instance, store them up, in other words, to be able to reproduce. But the ultimate goal for all plants is surviving and persisting in the ecosystem, and that usually means ultimately reproducing. All plants must reproduce. Some plants, like the K-selected species, delay that reproduction, but in the end they're able to reproduce very efficiently, for a much greater length of time. The annual plants get their reproduction in up front, and they are able to utilize the large amount of resources available rather than waiting. Okay? Alright, so different plants have different growth forms to be able to take one or another of these strategies. I'm going to start with annual plants. Now, annual plants aren't normally found in a rainforest. They're not normally found in a rainforest, and this is a good exam question, because they simply cannot tolerate the competition. There isn't enough resources in the tropical rainforest available for these annual plants to grow and reproduce in that short period of time. Instead, these annual plants must live in ecosystems which periodically release all their resources, and they will utilize those resources very quickly to put their reproductive effort in and produce seeds and offspring. So the typical example of these sorts of plants are the annuals. Oh, by the way, these plants are also known as R-selected plants. These annuals complete their life cycle in 1 year, or more accurately, in one growing season. And they usually occur in areas where there is a predictable time disturbance, and for instance like winter. But here we have some pictures of other short-term annual plants, I could guess you'd call them, which grow up after fire. So they will exist as seed in the soil until the fire passes through. Now the fire will just dump all the nutrients into the soil and remove all the shade from above, so these annuals will have maximum resources to be able to grow and to reproduce quickly. In more arid environments, the disturbance is the dryness, the drought. Now this drought may actually be the norm rather than just a short-term disturbance. But during time, there will be a rainfall event. When that rainfall event occurs, then suddenly all the nutrients and the moisture becomes available to the plants in huge amounts, okay, because no other plants are around. It's just bare earth. So there's massive amounts of resources around, so these plants can grow quickly and reproduce quickly. To take advantage of these abundant resources, annuals have an exponential rate of population increase. For so long as the resources are available and competition is low, these annuals will increase their population. They will reproduce quickly, and the offspring that they generate, if the resources are still available after they've reproduced, then the offspring will germinate and grow quickly to take advantage of the resources still available and reproduce themselves. So these are the typical density independent growth regulated plants. That's from conservation, so I won't talk about that too much. They are R-selected. Now, dispersal is very important for these annual plants. The reason why dispersal is very important is that quite often the large amount of resources available is not spread evenly across the landscape. This picture is a bit misleading. This is a picture of some annual flowers which will bloom if the wet season is good enough in desert areas, and all the seeds of these particular species are all scattered in the soil over a large area. And when it rains, and rains enough, all the microbes first of all wake up and release the nutrients into the soil, and then these plants will germinate to take advantage of the moisture and all the nutrients which have been released, and they will form huge fields. Now this is unusual, okay? More often the resources are released in more localized distributions, and it's very important that these annual plants are able to find those localized patches of abundant resources. So to do that, they need to travel across the landscape to find it, and therefore dispersal of the seed, of the offspring, to get them into the locality where this resource availability may occur is very important. So in this picture, it could be that this area of the desert has had a thunderstorm tracking across it. Now thunderstorms will bring rain, but in a long corridor which is maybe only 500 meters wide, several kilometers long. If the species has not got its seed distributed well enough across the landscape, then it wouldn't have any individuals able to take advantage of that abundance of resources. So, dispersal of seeds and spreading of seeds across the landscape to take advantage of any abundance of resources when it does turn up is very important for these annual plant forms which prioritize or aim to reproduce very quickly in their life cycle. We can also see this type of strategy in tropical rainforests. I'm going to talk a little bit about gaps. You all remember what gaps are. Gaps are basically when a tree in the forest dies and falls over. It opens up an opening in the canopy of the forest, and light gets in, water gets in, nutrients are released by the decaying vegetation, so that resources are abundant in that gap. The more are selected, or the plants which focus more on reproduction quickly, are the gap stage species, but they need to be able to spread across the forest to be sure that they, at least some of them, some individuals of the species, are in that gap when it occurs, and they are able to take advantage of all the resources. But ultimately, this annual life history type or strategy relies on huge amounts of resources, so that makes them very vulnerable to competition. So the survivors, the ones which are able to compete very well for those resources, will outcompete these annual plants, these R-selected plants, very easily. So the annual life history is very vulnerable to competition, and they must run away from competition, or they must complete their life cycle and reproductive event before any competition arrives. These annual plants are most common in ecosystems where there's a regular disturbance, as I said. This is the desert plants. Now this is a more unusual example. This is up in England, and these plants which you see underneath a forest canopy here are bluebells. Now these bluebells are annual plants. They grow up every year in the spring. They will grow up underneath in the understory of these woodlands and forests in England, and they only seem to occur in England in these big large patches, and they take advantage of the fact that the trees haven't put their leaves on yet, so they're able to grow and capture and use all the light before the canopy of the forest closes over. So what you're seeing here is the flowering of the bluebells, okay, and this occurs just before the canopy closes over for the growing season, for the summer, for the spring and the summer. So these bluebells avoid that competition by timing it so they are able to capture the light before the canopy closes over in this woodland in England. Okay, so these annual species reproduce very quickly and avoid competition in time as well as in space. Alright, let's move on now from the annual growth forms. Let's move on to the perennial growth forms. Now the perennial growth forms, as opposed to the annuals, perennial plants will grow for more than 1 year before reproducing. Okay? Damn. Monocarpic perennials will grow for more than 1 year. They will reproduce, but they will only reproduce once. So that is the origin of the term monocarpic. They only reproduce once and then they die. These species live for more than 1 year. They can include biennials, which live for 2 years, or they can include species which wait for 100 years before reproducing. They invest initially in survival, but ultimately they put everything into reproduction. An example of that we have on campus. This is a talipot palm, Talipot, talipot palm. It is a good example of a monocarpic perennial. This palm will grow for 40 to 50 years, and then suddenly over the course of a couple of weeks, it will suddenly send up this flowering spike and flower profusely, and then it will produce huge numbers of fruits which will rain down around the palm, and after that the whole tree dies. At least some of those seeds will germinate and start to grow again. If you look out by UE doubles there in that grassed over area, do you know where that pond is? Right next to that pond is a talipot palm. The mature adult was planted about 40 years ago, around Professor Duncan's time, and has flowered and died within the past 5 years or so. Past 3 years, I think. And you'll notice that there are seedlings around the base now. So this plant is managing to persist on UE campus, I guess you could say. So this is a good example of a monocarpic perennial. So these monocarpic perennials have advantages over the annual life history. First of all, they can survive in a high competition environment. So instead of putting all their resources into reproduction, instead they can survive in a high reproductive environment a high competition environment with low resources. They gather those resources, what resources they can. Okay? They use it to build bodies. They use it to store resources until they reach a point where they have enough resources for reproduction, at which point they will reproduce, and then quite often they will die. A couple of other famous monocarpic perennials, bamboo. Bamboo are infamous for being monocarpic perennials. They can grow for many years, but at least at some point in their lifestyle, the whole stand of bamboo will flower and then it will die. And it relies on seed to be able to form the next crop of bamboo. And this plant here is known as a Rafflesia. It grows in Southeast Asia, and it has the largest flower in the world. This flower is about 1 meter across. It smells like dead, rotting meat and attracts flies for pollination. But once this flower is finished and set seed, then the plant will die. So the advantages of being a monocarpic perennial is that these plants can survive in high competition environments, and that includes tropical rainforests. So both these plants and the talipot palm are all tropical species. Because they gather resources for many years, they can produce more seeds, and they can put more resources into each seed, make it bigger, make it the seedling more likely to survive because they've gathered more resources. They can also and this is a bit contentious, they can also see the environment of the year and make sure that it is favorable for offspring. So there may be environmental cues like droughts or fires or a particular temperature fluctuation which can cue the plant to be able to take advantage of abundant resources in the very near future. So they can be cued to reproduce by particular environmental cues, which mean to the plant that there will be a favorable environment, reproductive environment in the very near future. And in that way they can remove the uncertainty. One of the problems with the annual lifestyle and cycle is that once you start flowering, once you start reproducing, then there's no turning back. And if you're an annual, you must accept whatever the environment throws at you. There could be a drought just after the flowering period, so there's no resources to build the seeds. And that could be a big problem and mean the complete failure of reproduction for that year. Monocarpic perennials, to a certain extent, avoid those disadvantages. The next growth form of plant that I want to take a look at are the herbaceous perennials. Herbaceous perennials are plants which do not build a big body. They live in ecosystems which are periodically disturbed, but not disturbed to such an extent where all the resources are removed, and these perennials are able to survive. They are mainly represented by grasses and sedges, and they mainly exist in ecosystems which have a reasonable primary productivity. In other words, they have a reasonable amount of rainfall and nutrients and sunlight, but they are still periodically disturbed. So the perennial lifestyle allows a single individual many different goes at reproduction. Okay? So unlike the monocarpic perennial, these herbaceous perennials and the later woody perennials that we'll look at allow an individual to reproduce many times. So not only do these perennials live for more than 1 year, but they are able to flower and reproduce more than 1 year. So these herbaceous perennials invest initially in survival, and they only reproduce when survival is assured. So in terms of plants, that means that they will invest in underground subterranean perenniating organs which quite often store energy and nutrients. So like a corm, a tuber, a rootstock, or something like that, which is protected from the disturbance which may pass through. So the plant does not die. It doesn't need to reproduce initially. Instead, it can build up its store of survival nutrients, okay, until it has enough that it can reproduce. But it will only reproduce when the conditions are right. So some of these herbaceous perennials won't flower until after a fire, for instance, in a tropical ecosystem. So these herbaceous perennials don't grow very quickly, don't grow very big, but they ensure their survival by sequestering nutrients and biomass below the soil surface to avoid any disturbance. These herbaceous perennials will grow in periodically disturbed ecosystems. they're different. They take a different strategy to the annual plants in that they won't invest very quickly in reproduction. They first invest in survival, and once survival is assured, then they will reproduce. And they don't just reproduce once, they will reproduce many times. So they're able to survive for long periods and reproduce maybe every year or maybe after every fire event. Okay? These herbaceous perennials will dominate over woody perennials in areas where there's, as I said, a regular disturbance. That disturbance may be fire or it may be grazing. Savannas are examples of ecosystems which are able or are perfectly suited to herbaceous perennials. These plants will invest initially in survival, building their rootstocks and their subterranean resource pools, and then when they're grazed by the animals, they survive under the ground in much the same way, excuse me just a minute, in much the same way as, okay, yeah, sorry about that. So these herbaceous perennials will dominate over woody perennials, which can grow tall and capture the light in areas where constant grazing or fire will basically remove this above ground store of resources and biomass periodically. But when these disturbances are absent, these ecosystems can become very competitive, and the woody perennials begin to dominate over the herbaceous perennials, and the herbaceous perennials may soon be eliminated. Okay, so that brings us on to the woody perennials. This is the life history trait which is most favored in the wet tropics. So those are the trees. So the trees which make up tropical rainforest are woody perennials. Now these woody perennials are a response to pretty major resource limitations. So there's a lot of resources competed for. Now let me correct this. There are a lot of resources in these tropical rainforest ecosystems, but most of them are taken up and competed fiercely for. Because tropical rainforests tend to have enough water and enough nutrients, at least initially, it's light which soon becomes the limiting factor or the limiting resource. So species will tend to try and grow over the top of each other so that they will be able to compete better for the resource of light. And so this large woody structure, which a tree is, becomes the most efficient, the most competitive way of surviving in a tropical rainforest. So woody perennials capture and sequester resources in their bodies. They use those resources to build large bodies, large structures, to increase their competitiveness over time to get more resources until they have enough resources to be able to reproduce. Within the tropical rainforest, these woody perennials may be spread along a spectrum themselves. They're all perennials, and they all live for more than 1 year and reproduce for more than 1 year. And they're all woody and they're all tree-like. However, some of them may reproduce within 1 or 2 years, or even a few months, and live for a relatively short period of time, maybe 5 to 10 years. For instance, the bois-canoes. But others may be at the other end of the spectrum. They may grow very slowly. They may take a long time to gather enough resources together to hoist their photosynthetic structures, the leaves, up into the canopy where they get enough light so they can get enough resources to reproduce. But these trees may live for hundreds of years in a tropical rainforest. These species may only survive in areas where there is at least temporarily large amounts of resources, and in particular light, and they will be in the gaps. These species are able to survive anywhere. They're very good competitors, and they are able to survive and grow anywhere in the forest. They can only reproduce after a long period of time, however, when they get their leaves up into the canopy. So you get a spectrum between these gap stage species and these extreme K-selected species. Right, so woody perennials, the favored form of rainforest plants. Along with that spectrum within the woody plants, you have different trade-offs in the strategies which these plants can use. And I want to go through some of these trade-offs now. Really, we're looking at the trade-offs between these more R-selected gap stage species, which need the large amount of resources, and these extreme K-selected species, which are able to compete very efficiently until they come to dominate the ecosystem for long periods of time. Colonization and competitive ability is the first trade-off. The colonizer disperses quickly, finds available microsites with enough resources to use, but is booted out or eliminated when the K-selected competitor arrives. So a good colonizer will tend to be a very bad competitor, and that's pretty much what I've been telling you up until now. So the colonizer will put less resources into survival, into building a large competitive structure, but the K-selected, the competitor, the K-selected species will invest first in survival, into building that large woody body which enables them to survive wherever they are. Root growth and shoot growth are also another trade-off. Root-shoot ratio is adapted according to light, nutrient and water availability in forests. If there is a large amount of light available, then quite often the root-shoot ratio will be very high or relatively high. In the understory of the forest, where there's not much light available, you need more shoot to be able to capture what little light there is. So the root-shoot ratio is going to be much lower. So R-selected species will quite often have a high root-shoot ratio. K-selected species will tend to have a low root-shoot ratio. So this is a trade-off between allocation of resources to roots or to shoots. The R-selected species, because they're going after all the resources in the environment, will need to put in more roots. They need to use shoots less because it should be in a high light environment. The K-selected species need to invest much more in the shoots so they can gather what little light there is available to them in the understory. So some of the other trade-offs: seed size and seed number. Now, most plants would prefer to have very large seeds. Very large seeds means a very large seedling, and therefore means your offspring have a much better chance of surviving. They're more competitive. But unfortunately, large seeds means that you can only get fewer seeds. When your seeds are smaller, you can have much greater numbers. And this is quite important and a fundamental dichotomy between R-selected species, which tend to have small seeds in great numbers, and K-selected species, which tend to have fewer seeds but much larger. The larger seeds are more competitive, the smaller seeds are much less competitive, but if the resources are available, there can be more of them germinating. So the trade-off here is either a large seed or large numbers of seeds. Do I talk about dispersal? I should do. Defense and growth rate, abiotic resources. No, I don't. So I will talk about dispersal here. When you have a very small seed, as you can imagine, a small seed like this is much more easily dispersed than a huge big seed like this. So the trade-off between seed size and seed dispersal is very strong as well. The larger the seed, the less far it is dispersed. Small seeds can be dispersed, particularly by animals like birds and bats and parrots and monkeys. They can take these small seeds and spread them far and wide, and because there's enough of them, they can reach to every corner of the forest. The large seeds, on the other hand, fall primarily in the same general area as the parent tree. They're not dispersed very far at all. Now that seed size and seedling performance offsets this. Large seeds will produce much more competitive seedlings. So the seedlings will be bigger, they'll be able to access more light in a very dark understory, and they'll be able to survive. If your seed is too small, the seedling that can be produced is much smaller, and that seedling is likely not to survive in a shaded environment where there's not enough light. So it doesn't matter if a large seed doesn't disperse very far. Even if it's still in a shaded environment, it's still going to be competitive enough to survive. The small seed, on the other hand, needs to be dispersed, and it needs to be dispersed to a place where there is going to be abundance of resources. So seed size, seedling performance, and the ability of the seed to be dispersed are all intertwined. And we can also add into that the disadvantage of seed size has when it comes to predation. A very small seed represents a small amount of resources to a herbivore, and it's less likely to want to concentrate and search for all these small seeds. On the other hand, a large seed represents a big reward for minimal effort. So large seeds tend to be predated by herbivores much more quickly than small seeds. So large seeds will pay the price of a competitive seedling, in first of all not being able to be dispersed very far, but also being very attractive to predators. So they will lose a large number of their number through that. Because large seeds tend to be very much prey to predators, and because they don't really need a lot of resources straight away, they can germinate straight away. Okay, when they germinate straight away, they convert all those fats and lipids in the seed into lignans and cellulose, which is more or less undigestible to most animals, and so the amount of predation falls dramatically. Okay, so large seeds will tend therefore to have almost no dormancy. They're also known as recalcitrant. So in other words, they will germinate straight away to avoid seed predators. Small seeds, on the other hand, because they are better protected from seed predators by their small size, are more likely to show dormancy, and they can successfully hide in the soil for many years unnoticed by predators. So R-selected species quite often exhibit seed dormancy, but K-selected species, because they don't need to show dormancy and because dormancy is probably a disadvantage, tend to germinate straight away and show no dormancy. Now this is reflected if you do a study of digging up a patch of soil in the middle of the understory of the forest, taking it to the greenhouse and germinating what comes out. Generally what will come out is all R-selected species. So all these small seeds stored in the soil, and there will be very few, if any, K-selected species in there, because the seeds wouldn't be hiding there because they would have been predated or they would have germinated. Resource extraction and growth rate is another trade-off. Plants which have mechanisms to extract and retain nutrients from poor soil are less able to utilize abundant nutrients when they're available. So if you are very efficient at competing for your nutrients, then you are less able to take them up when there is large amounts around. And that's the same with light. Plants, like these K-selected plants, which can survive on very low light levels, cannot take full advantage of the full light which is found in a canopy gap. And that's really left to the gap stage species, which are able to utilize the vast amount of resources which are available in some of these gaps, both nutrients or light, and turn that large amounts of resources into a rapid growth rate. The K-selected species simply cannot do that. They don't have the physiological and morphological machinery to be able to capture and assimilate large amounts of resources like the R-selected species can do. And that's really just a reflection of these K-selected species having to select how to order their anatomies and their biochemistry to maximize their chances of surviving in a very low light environment. Defense and growth rate. Plants which put more resources into defense of existing tissue will sacrifice a rapid growth rate. Quite often, plants, as we will see in later lectures, are able to stack their leaves full of secondary compounds, and those secondary compounds will prevent or minimize the herbivorousness which is inflicted upon them by insects and other herbivores. But because they're directing a large amount of resources into these secondary compounds, because these molecules need some sort of effort to produce, then they cannot grow at a rapid rate. They cannot transfer that those resources which they use to make these chemicals. They can't convert those resources into cellulose and lignin, which can rapidly build more bodies. And conversely, the plants which are fast growing, like these gap stage species, will not be protected very well in terms of secondary compounds. So it's under conditions where rapid growth and rapid reproduction is more of an advantage under high resource availability, so you can get your reproductive effort off not only before competition finally brings you down, but also before the insects totally eat you out. Okay. Male-female reproductive functions. Now it's been shown that males have a less of a reproductive commitment than females. So females will need to invest a lot more in reproduction than males. Most plants are hermaphrodites, which means they have both male and female parts to their flowers. So male pollen tends to be less expensive than female seeds. So when there is less resources around, then these K-selected species tend to focus more on producing pollen than producing seeds. So females will tend to show greater trade-offs because they need more resources to produce their seeds to reproduce. So male and reproductive functions may vary when it comes to different resources. R-selected species may have more female reproductive output, and K-selected species may have more male reproductive output. But it's never completely eliminated, obviously, so you would always have some male reproductive output in the gap state species, and you would always have some female reproductive output in the K-selected species. Just the proportions will shift. Alright, so those are some of the trade-offs which plants have, particularly in a tropical rainforest. I just want to mention now the resources for which plants will compete. First of all, the abiotic resources, and we've gone through a lot of these already. Light. Trees are obviously the preferred life form, the most competitive life form, because that tall structure overtops all the smaller plants. Water is also a resource which is competed for, less so in tropical rainforests because there tends to be large amounts of water, almost too much water in some cases, but there can be shortages and competition, and particularly in drier biomes, in maybe deciduous forests and so on. So roots become more important to compete if that's the case. Nutrients can be quite limiting, and we've talked about how plants adapt to low nutrient conditions and how more resources are directed into roots to be able to more efficiently scavenge those nutrients. There are some biotic resources which plants will compete for. Pollinators and seed dispersers, interestingly enough. Don't know why I have that there. Pollinators and seed dispersers can be in short supply at certain times of the year. So plants may need to compete with one another to attract them. So they need to offer rewards which allow these pollinators and seed dispersers to come to their species preferentially. Plants will also spread their flowering and seeding times over the course of the year to try and avoid competition with other species and find areas of the year or times of the year where pollinators and seed dispersers are more available, and therefore pollination is carried out more efficiently and seed dispersal is carried out more efficiently. Okay? And also with less cost. So biotic resources can also be competed for. And finally, niche partitioning. Niche partitioning is the division of the resource into segments. Now, when it comes to rainforest trees, there's been a lot of work done on this, and there has been mixed results to see whether different species partition the resource continuum into discrete niches. Generally, it's been found that most trees really overlap with their niche requirements. So effectively, they are always competing for one another for resources. And it really makes people wonder how that all of these different plant species can survive, all these different tree species can survive, even though they are all competing together for the same nutrients. Niche partitioning is much more prevalent when it comes to non-tree species in the rainforest. So things like the understory plants, the epiphytes, they will specialize in a particular microenvironment which can support them. And because it's a tropical rainforest and very stable, that niche is always going to be present. So specialization makes sense. Okay, well, I'm going to have to leave you there for this lecture. Hopefully you have been well and truly introduced to the wonderful world of plant ecology, and in particular competition between plants and the different ways in which plants will compete for resources, with the ultimate goal of reproducing and therefore persisting and continuing in the ecosystem in which they find themselves. Okay, thank you very much.